Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I am here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we are going to be talking about interviews and adopter categories. This is one of our targeted course-specific webinars where we look at a particular assignment and use this as the window for discussing the genre that it fits in, the tasks, and things like the peculiar formatting that comes when you're writing about things like interviews. Because we're well into the semester, I'm just going to gloss briefly through some basic information. We work with students throughout the process. We do not charge for our services. We work with students in almost every online program at ACU. And we work with students through a combination of webinars such as this, through asynchronous appointments where you schedule a time, send us a copy of your draft by that time, and we send you feedback generally within 24 hours. We're also available for real-time appointments via phone or Zoom. For a real-time appointment, just send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu with a couple days and times that work for you, and we'll see if we can match you up with our team. And we also have recordings of the webinars, sample papers, templates, and more on the Online Writing Center website. Webinars coming up, we have a few more that may be of interest to you, but I want to tell you that we have a growing catalog of webinars available on the Online Writing Center website. And a newer feature that we have that is available on the Writing Center website is that we have added a sorted catalog of all the course tie-ins. So you should be seeing my screen now where I've brought up the Writing Center webpage for our webinars. And you see at the top, we have a couple links here. So at the top, there's a list of the webinars for this term, followed by a general catalog of all the webinars that we have recordings available for. Now, in between those two is something new that what I want to show you right now, because we have gone through and we've tagged each of our webinars to include the tie-in and for particular assignments and courses, and made a quick sortable thing here. So if you're attending this webinar, you're probably enrolled in the EdD program. So let's go ahead and look at EdD. You see this lead EdD link here. I click on this, and now it shows me in sorted fashion all the tie-ins for lead 701, the tie-ins for 711, and so on and so forth. So we've taken an extra step to make it easy for you to find what tie-ins we have for this term and for any webinar recordings that we have available right now. All right, let's head back to our slide deck now. All right, so we are going to be focusing on three things today. First, we're going to talk about how to write about interviews in APA style. Then we're going to look specifically at Leadership 731's Week 4, Activity 2, the Adopter Categories assignment. And then we're going to talk about how to go from the assignment parameters to outlining and drafting. Now, encourage questions as we go along. This is intended to help students such as yourselves. And so if you have questions about anything in this assignment, just ask away. I might not get to it immediately, but we are here to answer questions and guide you through the process. And we're also joined by one of the instructors for this course, so you have an extra opportunity to pose questions. All right, with that introduction, let us launch into the main body of our webinar today. So let's talk about how to write about interviews in APA style. Now, a basic precept of APA style is to show your sources, to tell the reader where the information came from. And depending on the particular type of source, you may have a more formal citation or a less formal one. And there are different ways to acknowledge the different types of information. The unifying precept is tell the reader how you know what you know. And so with interviews, we have three basic categories as far as APA style is concerned. Is it a published interview, a personal interview, or a formal interview with a research participant? Now, a published interview, this is something that is retrievable. For example, it could be published in a newspaper article, it could be published in a journal article, it could be a video that you found on YouTube where someone is doing an interview. If it's published and thus available, accessible to the public, we need to cite it using a formal citation, the author date citation, and to have an entry in the references section. Now, if it's a personal communication, you just ask them, whether it's you did that via a Skype call, a Zoom call, email, or in person or phone, it gets cited as a personal communication, meaning they told you that personally. So, for example, if it's Elizabeth Smith, we'd cite E. Smith as the author, the person giving the communication, and we'd have that personal communication, comma, and then the date information, July 19th, 2020. So E. Smith, personal communication, July 19, 2021, stated that whatever they did. They stated that they believed I was a good leader with these traits, for example. You can also use this sort of citation to provide the source for facts and figures. For example, if you're interviewing a school superintendent about their district and they tell you a set of numbers, you can cite them as a source for that numbers, even though they're not published there. You can say, oh, well, they told me that, according to them. And that accomplishes that basic function of acknowledging your sources, of showing where you got this information from. Now, if we're talking about a research interview, you're doing a study, well, APA has particular rules for how you will describe your research participants. And the basic precepts of what you need to say there are to give the purpose in the interview, to describe the process by which the interview was conducted, to describe the participants themselves, the duration of the interviews, the questions or prompts that you were giving to them, including if this was a published survey instrument, like a questionnaire, to cite that, to describe the process by which you analyzed or mined the interviews for whatever conclusions you've reached, and those conclusions themselves. And this may or may not also involve giving quotations and transcripts and other things like that. So what do we do with this? Well, when you're writing about an interview, we start with asking a series of questions to determine which of these applies. So if this is a published interview, it's out there somewhere, whether that's, again, a video, a television broadcast, a transcript in an article, if it's published, then, okay, well, then we cite the publication and list it in the reference list. If the answer is no, then we go to our second question. And is this an interview that you conducted, but it wasn't part of a formal study? And you'll know when you're doing a formal study. For one thing, if you're doing your dissertation research for your formal study, you will have to apply to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, for permission to do this and make sure that you're following rules for ethical research and things like that. So if it's part of a formal study, then you'll go on to question 3. If it's you ask this question number 2, is this an interview that you conducted but not part of a formal study? And the answer is yes. Then we're in that realm where we're citing it as a personal communication, which again doesn't end up in your reference list. Why doesn't it end up in your reference list? Well, because it's not published, someone can't just go and look up that email that you are citing that went right to you, or they told it to you over the phone, for example. Now, question number 3 on our list. Is this an interview that you conducted as part of a formal study? If the answer is yes, then we need to introduce and describe this interview and the process around it in the body of your text. And we're going to follow the normal rules for quoting, except the citations will be a little bit different, because this is going to be something where if you say include the transcript of the interview as an appendix, then you'll have see Appendix A, for example, to refer people to that full transcript. Or if it's only published in the body, then your parenthetical citation may say something like, oh, participant A, to clarify that's the person who said it. Now, in some assignments and dissertations, you may include the full transcript as an appendix. Generally, you don't include the full transcript in the body of a chapter or article because it's distracting, but it's very common for researchers to publish the raw interview transcripts so that other people can follow up and reference them. And that is something that if you have questions about it, when you come to your proposal or when you're writing up chapter 4, please feel free to ask. All right, so that's interviews in general. Now, we always want to make sure that we are matching what we are writing to the context, to the requirements. So this is where we switch gears to look at the instructions themselves, and I'm grateful that we have the instructor for this course to ask any clarifying questions. So if you have any questions after I talk through this, please go ahead and type your question in the chat, or if you have a question you'd like to ask but you're not comfortable asking it openly, you can use the chat tool and select my name and send me a private message and ask your question, and then I can ask it on your behalf. So again, we're going to delve into the specific assignment, the Week 4 Activity 2 Adopter Categories assignment for Leadership 731. And you'll see that this assignment comes with a preamble, instructions saying, for this activity, you will select 2 individuals. They can be friends, colleagues, or family members to interview in order to determine their adopter category. You will submit your interview with the questions used and the responses, along with your rationale of the adopter category in which you place them. And then there's a specific prompt to compare and contrast the responses, and a note saying, don't forget to use the resource provided in the introduction of this module. And then we have some more instructions saying, the format of this mini paper should mirror a chapter 4 of a dissertation to include the purpose of the interviews, the process for conducting the interviews, an introduction to your participants, how long the interviews lasted, your analysis of the transcripts, and conclusions of their adopter categories. There's an additional instruction saying you should, for this assignment, include the transcripts as an appendix and follow APA guidelines for formatting the paper. Okay, we have a nice, clear list to follow. And let's just take a look at the rubric here and see what the grading is going to be on. And we see, okay, of the 10 points here, 10%, one of those points, goes from doing the interview, describing the interview's purpose, process, length of interviews, and transcripts. So that's the basic detail. And that half the credit for this paper is that you should be providing the interview questions, and those interview questions you write should demonstrate that you understand the concepts of the adopter categories, that you provide a rationale for the categorization that you do, and align it with the generalizations for that category, and that another 40% of the points go for having a comparison and contrast of the interview responses. So you're not just going to be reporting, well, they said this, and so we categorize them here. You're going to be comparing these two individuals. Now, there's no instruction saying you must assemble contrasting people, but say if you had 2 people at your workplace that you were interviewing, you'll probably have more to write about on the contrast side if they're not identical in beliefs and experience and everything like that. So you can help set yourself up to have an easy and successful time writing about it if you select diverse people to interview. And in this case, because they're just 2, there are many different ways that you can choose that diversity. This is similar to how you might be doing your research, where you don't want to have, in most cases, a homogeneous sample. Because if you get people who all went to the same college, who all grew up in the same county, who all work in the same district, there's probably going to be a bit of groupthink, and you'll have not useless results, but if you're looking for a broad selection of what will give you the most general applicability, that's probably not the right sample for that. And I'll give you a professional example of this. So I was teaching at a university in Tennessee, And we had a cohort where it turned out that about 70% of the students were all working in the same school district in Georgia. So in the discussion posts, they had a lot of thoughts about how things should be done that happened to match the way it was done in their district. And they'd all taught in their district for pretty much their whole professional career. So naturally, their lived, their worked experience was, well, this is how things are. And the trap there, the potential problem was that it would be easy to assume if you didn't track their background that, well, since there's such clear commonality, well, this must reflect the teacher population in general, when in fact we had to acknowledge, well, hold on, these results may not be applicable to the larger group. And in this particular case, because there's some notable divergences from everyone who wasn't as part of that group, that we need to keep that in mind. All right. Now, something that we want to make sure we look at is this note here that the format of this paper should mirror chapter 4 of a dissertation. And I will say that this is a lot easier to do than when I started my graduate studies, because I started my graduate studies where you could order copies of dissertations, but it cost money. They were literally printing dissertations from microfilm. Nowadays, you can just download a PDF from ProQuest. Heck, if you wanted to read my dissertation, you could do that from an institutional repository for free. Without needing an institutional subscription, you can just find it on the internet. And that is in fact true of ACU dissertations as well, because we can go to the institutional repository, the Digital Commons, and look at recently published Doctor of Nursing Practice and EdD dissertations to see not just what does a Chapter 4 look like in general, but how it specifically looks like at ACU and for a Chapter 4 that's describing interviews. So I've included here in the slide deck a number of sample links. And if you have RSVP'd for the webinar, you will get a copy of the slide deck. You can look at these particular dissertations yourself and follow those links. But if you didn't RSVP, just type your email address in the chat room and I'll add you to the list to get the copy of the slide deck and link to the recording. And let's look at some samples there. So I've underlined some text here that shows some of the things that you're being asked to do in this list of, describe the purpose of the interviews, the process, introduce the participants, etc., etc. So we see here on the third line, the study participants shared geographical and life history homogeneity in that they taught dual credit at the study institution. So it's pointing out there was a commonality in that study. Now, that's not necessarily bad. It is something you want to keep in mind because this is something where if you're looking to find a population that has this particular thing in common, in this case, teaching dual credit classes, that you want to have a population that actually knows about the thing that you're interviewing. So, and there's even a note there, this homogeneity ensured that the population was most appropriate for the study. The next sentence continues describing some of those key bits that the instructions say that we should be making sure are documented. Dual credit adjunct faculty members comprise the population of the study. Let's differentiate between the sample, which is the participants, and the population, which is the larger group that sample, the participants are recruited from and represent. So dual credit adjunct faculty members comprise the population of the study. Great. And then we already know that the study participants were recruited from that. And those people completed the questionnaire and subsequent interviews. Okay, so we know that the data collection was conducted in two different parts. There was a questionnaire and then interviews. Potential interviewees self-selected per the information on the questionnaire, and this resulted in 10 interviewees. So we now know the sample size for the interview stage. Thus, I did not need to engage in snowball sampling to achieve the desired number of interviewees. If you're wondering what is snowball sampling, this is a method of recruiting people where you go ahead and you leverage their contacts. So you could interview someone and say, okay, now that we're all done, do you have anyone that you recommend that I also recruit? Any people that you might nominate as being, in this case, dual credit teachers? And so snowball sampling is a great way to work through things that are socially connected, like, oh, this particular classification, or if you're working through a particular discipline or specialty. So often in the design of a study, you'll have your plan for recruiting, and then a contingency, an additional step that you'll do if you don't get the minimum number that you were looking for. In this case, they said they got 10 interviewees just from the self-selection, so they didn't need to expand it and their recruitment to get that. Okay, great. So we know what they did and didn't do to get those people. I've also included an extract from another dissertation here where we see a description of the process for data collection. You see, the second sentence says, study interviews were conducted electronically through video conferencing software and were recorded. Now, if you say just use Skype for all of the interviews, you could say, oh, yes, Skype. But if you are more open-ended, like if the participant says, well, I don't have Skype, but can you do a Google Hangout? Then having this more generic, oh, well, it was through video conferencing software, that's fine. It describes things well enough. Because ultimately, the exact medium doesn't matter so much as the general type and what you do with it. Exceptions would be if there's a particular feature or something that you are using. And there is some interview software out there that will automatically anonymize the person with video filter, so you can't see exactly who you are talking to, and it'll also distort their voice. And this is usually used in particularly sensitive things where you want people to be able to speak freely, but they really want their privacy to be preserved to the point where you don't even know who's involved. And so if you're using specialized software like that, you'd want to give us more detail about that. But this looks like it's pretty straightforward. They were interviewing, and it just happened they were using video conferencing software for that. And you'll see that there's a justification for that choice. The video aspect of the interviews was important as it gives the researchers the best opportunity to understand that the innermost deliberation of the lived experiences of research participants study also includes nonverbal responses. So why are they using video instead of just doing a audio only or phone interview? Because they were looking at nonverbal responses like body language or facial expressions. So if you say something and then they make a face and then they collect themselves and they give a very polite response, that tells you something in addition to the words that are being said. So they have a justification for why they were specifically using video. That's good. You'll see that the next paragraph gives us some key information, like the length of the interview, so it ranged from 45 to 60 minutes, okay? And the goal of the interviewing, to find the influence they believe that this particular criteria had. And we see in the second sentence of the second paragraph, participants were asked 6 open-ended interview questions and 4 demographic questions. So this is a great level of detail. The demographic questions, that's things like, oh, well, what is your racial or ethnic background? How do you identify? Things that help you understand the group as a whole, their makeup. And then we see that of those 10 questions that were asked, 4 were demographic and 6 were open-ended. And a common mistake that I see in this kind of assignment is that students will just write, oh, they were asked 6 interview questions. Well, interview questions just means the format was an interview and you asked them questions. It doesn't tell us if it was something where they were able to respond more or if they had to pick from a set of responses. So that's the difference between open-ended and closed. Open-ended allow them to participate and go at some length. And, in 45 to 60 minutes, you'd expect that at 6 open-ended questions that they can talk at some length, and you can even ask little follow-ups and clarifications and stuff. All right. In addition, we see the detail, they were given the interview questions in advance, and those questions were asked as they were there, rather than saying, well, here's a general idea, the exact questions will vary. Here we have a extract from another chapter 4 describing interviews, and we'll see that they list the software they were using, they list the transcription service they were using, and describes the efforts made to maintain privacy here. Now, for this assignment, you're probably not going to use something that incorporates this specific encryption here. It's a preliminary thing. It's not getting published out for the world to see, but it gives you an idea of some of the things that you can write about. And when you're dealing with sensitive things, confidential information, that, of course, you want to protect the privacy of the participants. And let me just ask a question quickly here, because we have Dr. Yeager here. You are not expecting the students to be doing quite this level of elaborate things with, having a transcriptionist and encryption and destroying the records there. This is an assignment with more practical bounds, so they're not expected to do this level of detail, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, this is a
Okay.
strictly a class assignment.
So let us briefly recap what the goals of this assignment are, and then we're going to delve into the drafting portion. So remember, this assignment says we need to interview 2 people and determine their adopter category. Need to compare and contrast those responses, and we need to make sure that the provided resources used, that in case you haven't looked at it or you've forgotten, let me bring that up really quick. So you should be seeing a Word document here where we have this list of adopter categories here. It's like innovator, venturesome, early adopter, respected, early majority to deliberate, and so on and so forth. So this is linked from the assignment and page, and I will say that something I see is that often students will focus on doing the other things and forget to circle back and use these specific categories there. So make sure that's on your to-do list. Okay, now I did get a question that someone sent me privately, so let's answer that before we delve into the next step. So the question is, do you need to identify your interview subjects by name? And the answer is, well, it depends on the parameters here. So if you were, say, doing a published study and you have promised your participants anonymity, it would be poor form, very unethical for you to publish their name in your dissertation that would go out. And so you want to keep that in mind as you are doing this assignment, that it is a warm-up for the work you'll be doing when you write your chapter 4. In most cases, for this kind of assignment, you'll be expected to give their first initial and their last name as part of identifying them. But if there is some privacy thing, let's say you were interviewing them about illegal activity, you might then describe them in more general terms, but not give their direct name, in which case you would identify them, say, as a school superintendent. And we have a clarification from the instructor, from Dr. Yeager, that you can use pseudonyms here. Great, thank you. And I'll show you in a moment how to introduce a pseudonym. All right, excellent question. And yes, you do want to make sure you protect your participants' identities, and you can refer to them by their role and introduce a pseudonym so that you can have more naturalistic phrasing there. At this point, let us change gears here and move into the outlining section, because we're moving through here. We're about 30 minutes in, and we want to get down to brass tacks. So I have prepared here a copy of the APA course paper template that I'm just going to clean up really fast So if you're not familiar with this template is downloadable through most courses and through the Writing Center website. It does a lot of the basic formatting for you and will also facilitate and speed up the process of transferring your document to our dissertation template when you are working on that. So I'm just going to delete all these comments really quick using the review section on the toolbar. So from the start, home, I go to review and select delete and delete all comments to document. And you can fill in the title of the paper and your name and things like that later. So where I want to start is by making sure that we have a complete list of the things that we need to include for this assignment. And we're going to start just by copy and pasting the assignment instructions here. Don't worry about the formatting. We just want to make sure we have a list of all the things that we're going to be working with. And now we can go ahead and see what we can take out to focus our list here. So we're almost always writing in APA style, so we'll just cross it out. We don't need a reminder there. And we can take out some things like that. And what we're doing is analogous to taking a Sharpie and blacking out some of the instructions. We focus just on what we have to actually do and include. We're reducing this to an outline in a requirements list. And as we go through this, we see, oh, there are actually some things that tell us what should be in here. And when you have something like the purpose, all right, well, in a dissertation chapter, you use a heading to mark that out. So let's use one here. And same thing with this process. And you'll see I am using these built-in styles here. So I want this to be an APA level 1 heading. So I select the text, and with the styles pane here open, I just select APA level 1. And okay, the participants. And not all of these details necessarily need to have their own section. And you may find that you lump some things together, but at least for now, this is a great way of making sure that we get all these things here. Now, one of those questions is, how long should this assignment be? And that I can't tell you. Uh, uh, Dissertations and interviews, some of them are longer than others. And what I can say is that the more focused and specific you make it, the more concise it can be. So if you have very long, vague questions about, oh, tell me your background for the demographics, that'll take more than if you ask discrete questions about, okay, who are you and where you're from? And oh, I got a message here. A question from someone asking, do I recommend developing interview questions? Well, that is a very good question to have. You will have an easier time comparing and contrasting the interview responses if you write out a standard list of questions and then ask the same questions, or at least the same starting questions, to both people. And Professor Yeager has clarified that an interview of around 15 minutes is generally good. Thank you for that clarification. So with that in mind, okay, how many questions is reasonable? Now, in one of those examples we were looking at, they were asking 10 questions and allowing for up to 45 to 60 minutes for the responses. So keeping that in mind, you're probably not going to go that long because 15 minutes is the ballpark here. So accounting for a different level of detail, you probably don't want to have more than 6 to 8 questions is probably a good thing to get you through a 15 minutes of interview. So if you present those questions and as part of this paper, great, because that tells us how you were conducting the interviews, including the questions. And we need to know something about who these participants are. Those would be the demographic questions. And we need to know what kind of things you're asking them to classify them. And so you might go back and look at these categories and say, okay, well, what questions will help me classify them here? And some of this, like education and social status, you probably don't want to ask flat out, you know, uh, are you highly educated? For one thing, that's subjective. But if you have a couple quick questions to ask, what's your highest level of education? What's your highest degree? Did you grow up in upper class, middle class, etc.? That lets you do some demographic questions you can ask very quickly, and then spend more time on the questions that will take more analysis and unpacking. So spend your time wisely there, and as I see Professor Yeager echoing, use these characteristics to build your question list. All right, let's go back to that outline in progress. So process for conducting the interviews, that's going to be a fairly quick thing to ask, but what are our basic details there? Well, the medium, is that going to be phone, Skype? The duration. Was there follow-up? Something you may see in the example dissertations, there's something called member checking, where you send a transcript to someone and ask, hey, did I get that right? Is that the right person you mentioned, for example? And the one of the purposes of that is to make sure that it's accurate. Do you need to do that for this assignment? Not necessarily, but for other things down the road, it's good to keep in mind that that is one option. And I see Professor Yeager has given an excellent piece of advice. Don't ask the interviewers what they believe their questions are, what the categories are. That's an excellent piece of advice because you're trying to make your own diagnosis. And anytime you ask someone to classify themselves, it introduces the potential for uh, their own subjective bias. And for this, you do any study, and a majority of people tend to rate themselves as above average in some category. So you want to be doing the assessment yourself. And as Professor Yeager points out, developing questions that will have them start talking about how they adopt new technology or adopt change. Great. Uh, and that's a good bridge for talking about those questions themselves. Types of questions. And there are going to be multiple categories where this can go in. We talked about demographic. Are there closed or close-ended questions? Or open-ended? And you might be also categorizing this. Is this going to be a structured questionnaire where you just ask the questions there and nothing more? Or are these semi-structured where you can ask follow-up questions? Now, you'll see both types used in research, but the general purpose of close-ended questions is to get very consistent responses to just those specific questions. Open-ended, which you'll probably be asking a lot of open-ended ones for this. Open-ended, the goal is that you start them talking and then you generate the material, the information, the raw data and transcript that you can then analyze for those responses. And it's a lot of that between the lines things that you really helps anchor an analysis and that classification. In this case, for the participants, there's going to be participant 1 and participant 2. So, for example, if we are lumping the duration up here as part of the process, we say, oh, well, we got that here. Let's just cross that out so we know we took care of it above. Great. You don't want to be repeating yourself unnecessarily. You find there's a logical place to put that up here while we're discussing that. Just make sure you cross it out down here. All right, participant 1. so I said I would explain pseudonyms. So let's say that we have, okay, let's say we're interviewing a school uh, superintendent, and now you can refer to them as participant one. That's not a problem. But if you're going to be referring to them uh, a lot, it gets a little awkward. And what differentiates participant one from two? It gets very dry when you're doing a longer interview. So another way to do it, you can assign them a name. John, pseudonym, was a now you'll see in some published interviews they use present tense and past tense. In general, I will steer you into using past tense because this allows you to fix the observation at the time of the interview. So what happens afterwards? Well, they might resign, they might get fired, they might retire. And so when you're writing your dissertation and you identify the specific range of time, well, the interviews were conducted in July 2021, and at the time of the study, or at the time of the interview. Okay, now let's just. Now you can cite this here. And so we have the key pieces of information. Who was it who said it? How did they communicate it? Through a personal communication to you. When was that? On this date. And you've already introduced them as having that pseudonym, and that's all we need to identify them. And so you can just say, John said this later on. Okay, let's see where we are here. Okay, transcripts. Include the transcripts as an appendix. So you have a choice here. Appendices go after the references list. So you'll want to go ahead and insert a page break. So you can just press Command Enter if you're on a Mac or Control Enter if you're on a PC. And then we're going to add, if we have just one appendix, you just call it appendix and say appendix transcript. If you're going to list these transcripts separately, appendix A, appendix B, so on and so forth. Depends on the length here. We'll go with one for now. And then you would have the transcript here. Appendices can follow a number of different formats, but a very common one is to just identify the speakers. For example, to have interviewer, and then you just list the things that they said. So then you can have the questions and the answers. Now, if you're asking semi-structured questions, you'll get some follow-up here where you'd have these different questions or prompts here. And if you are doing a if you're doing a structured interview where you're just asking those specific questions, you don't need to bother with saying interview here. You can just list the question there because those questions are going to be exactly the same because it's a structured questionnaire. Another comment from the instructor to use direct quotes to add credibility. Yes, the more you can ground your analysis and your conclusions and specifics, the better able you will be able to convince your readers of that. So, for example, if we're doing this analysis of the transcript here, and let's just say that we're going to classify someone in the early majority deliberate category. So you might start writing this out. Say, okay, is the early majority deliberate adopter category. Uh, And so with things like this, you say, okay, so I'm classifying them this, and here's some evidence for why, and ground that in the quote. Now, where should this go? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the citation part will generally go at the end of a sentence here. So, although the quote itself is earlier, because the citation, we don't want that to interrupt the flow of ideas, that's why it goes at the end of the sentence. Okay, let's see, other things. Analysis of the transcripts. So how did you do that? There are a number of different ways. One of them is to do, for example, word cloud analysis, where it shows you what are the most frequently mentioned terms. You could do a thematic analysis, but tell us how. And just explain your rationale here. Okay, so we have been talking through this, and we've covered, I think, the main points here. So let's go back to the slides and just reflect on this assignment and uh, take a moment to step back and say, okay, what's the goal here? And what are we aiming to do here to make sure that the big picture is covered? So for this assignment, remember, we're going to determine their adopter category, submit the interview with the questions used, okay, and the responses, along with your rationale for the adopter category you're placing them in, and compare and contrast the responses. I've seen many drafts for these assignments over the years, and that is one that I want to make sure that you don't forget to compare and contrast those responses. So going back to our outline, where might that go? Well, a good place would be either in or immediately after that transcript analysis, because this is where you're shading what you did and thus what you found. And one way to structure this, not the only one, is but to do the comparison of commonalities and then contrasts. How are these people different? What do they have in common? Might be that they have some things in common, but you end up classifying them in different things because of a key difference here or there. So what exactly you're going to put there, that'll depend on the people you interview and the questions you ask them. At this point, I want to invite Professor Yeager. Is there anything else that you would like students to know or pay special attention to before we let them go this evening?
Sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you walking the students through this.
And this is
Um,
a great time for anyone who is attending, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, to pose those now, whether you want to ask them privately or publicly.
can you hear me, Basil? Can you hear me?
Okay, I got a question here. Give me just a moment to read through this. All right, so the question is, do we need to use a published questionnaire? Excellent question. So if you look through the sample dissertations, you will find that many of the studies use a standardized questionnaire. And there are many reasons why you might do that. One reason that you might use a standardized questionnaire is because you want to compare results with another data set. Like if you interview these two people who work for your company, and then you look at, well, here's a study of people working in this industry, and we see, oh, they have these things in common, or they have these other things that are not in common. And that's perfectly fine. That's probably more work than you need to do for this assignment unless you happen to know one already that you want to use. Keeping in mind that you have this particular adopter category, a task that you need to do. And if you happen to have read one that did this and had a reasonably concise questionnaire, you could do it. Just make sure you cite it accordingly. All right, so that was part one. The second thing is to make sure that you are that there's a reason for um, doing this particular comparison. And if your part of your reason for doing the comparison for using that published questionnaire is that you want something that's being validated, that's being tested and found to work for a particular population or a broad group of populations, sure. Uh, if you're talking like Myers-Briggs personality indicators, those are used by thousands of people every year, and so that is not a problem at all if you want to use it precisely because of that comparison thing. So yes, you can use a standard questionnaire. It's probably going to be more work than you need to do for this assignment unless you already have some familiarity or you're specifically planning this as, well, I want to use this for the eventual study that I do, and so might as well get started now and be able to reuse some of that later. Um, with that said, uh, I think that let me just check in. Professor Yeager, anything else you wanted to add?
Yes, just focus on identifying the adopter categories. You don't have to go outside the go outside and find another instrument. Um, use the characteristics. There's going to be commonality in across the types of categories for you to make good questions to tease out what adopter category they are. And remember, these adopter categories are not hard and fast. You can find overlap between the categories. You know, some people are complex, individuals are complex. And so I may be one way in one situation or one context and a different in another. So just be conscious of the fluidity of these things and explain and describe that in your papers. And I think you will be fine.
Great. Thank you for adding that explanation and detail there.
Mhm.
Um, Now, you and I discussed in advance some common pitfalls, and I think you just alluded to one that I was hoping to tease out just a little bit more, which is going above and beyond to the point of distraction. And, we want to make sure it's a assignment that's done well, but also that you don't go in, write pages and pages more than you have to. So you mentioned earlier that 15 minutes is a good ballpark for the interviews. And is there anything else on that that you'd like to add? I have seen drafts where people have paragraphs and paragraphs of conclusion where they just go over everything. Um, would you say that that sounds excessive or about right? Or
5 to 7 pages plus a cover, plus a title page and references, and then of course all of your transcripts and everything should be sufficient. So 5 to 7 pages of text and analysis will be, I think you can say everything you need to say in that.
great. All right. Well, for everyone who has typed their email address to request a copy of the slide deck and the recording, I've got your email addresses down. Uh, I think we're at a good point to wrap up for this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Yeager, for joining us this evening and for providing those additional details. If you joined us part way, don't worry, we recorded the whole thing, and that recording should be posted later this evening, and we'll send it out with a copy of the slide deck to everyone who RSVP'd to the webinar or gave us their email address here. And those recordings are always posted to the Writing Center website. So if you missed something or you're planning on attending and something runs late, don't worry, you'll always be able to catch up on the recording. All right, with that, let us call it an evening. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a good rest of the evening.